The conference room smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a scent I had learned to associate with my invisibility. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, listening to the chatter, the self-important laughter, the clinking of glasses as colleagues celebrated promotions, mergers, and great decisions. They didn't notice me. They never did. Elise, the quiet one, the assistant, the background hum in their professional symphony. That was the role I had been given, and I had played it perfectly. Until now. Today, a subtle tension had begun to ripple through the room. The leadership announcement was due any minute, and I had already received confirmation that the controlling shares my late mother had left me were in order. Legally binding. My name would be listed first, ahead of every name they assumed superior, every colleague who had whispered behind my back about my quiet incompetence. They had no idea that the balance of power would shift irreversibly with a single email, a single document, a single public announcement. I smiled faintly, calm, collected, sipping my coffee as the partners continued their boastful conversations. The irony was delicious. Years of being ignored, overlooked, and underestimated had culminated in this precise moment of quiet, unstoppable authority. Elise, the invisible one, was about to become the voice that commanded attention, the name that dictated terms, the force they had never anticipated. Part 1. The Setup. I remembered the first day I walked into the firm, a fresh graduate, polite, eager, invisible. Everyone had glanced over me, judges, managers, senior analysts. None bothered to learn my name properly. Elise? One had asked with thinly veiled skepticism, as if the sound of it were already a burden. I nodded, smiled politely, and learned to take notes, organize schedules, and manage tasks without making waves. The firm was loud, ambitious, self-important, and full of people who believed visibility equaled competence. I quickly understood that patience, observation, and discretion were far more powerful than ostentation. I worked quietly, filing reports, drafting memos, organizing client data, and listening. I listened to their boastful strategies, their small victories, and their careless mistakes. Every whispered plan, every arrogant assumption, every laugh at my quiet nature I catalogued. I absorbed details about the firm, its finances, its assets, and most importantly, its leadership structures. They were blind to me, and that blindness became my advantage. Years passed. I remained unnoticed, a background figure, the assistant who could be relied on yet never credited. I tolerated their sneers and dismissive glances because I had a far bigger plan than their petty judgments could comprehend. Elise was quiet, yes, but that quietness was deliberate, a shield for the long game I had been preparing. When my mother passed, she left behind more than memories. She left legal documents, controlling shares in the very firm my colleagues assumed I had no stake in. I kept the knowledge private, silent, letting it simmer, letting the timing become perfect. Today, those shares would assert themselves publicly, shifting power in ways no one expected. As I sat at my desk, opening the final announcement draft, I felt the calm thrill of inevitability. My name was listed first. The board had no choice but to honor my legal authority. The colleagues who had treated me like background noise would see me, finally, not as a quiet assistant, but as the owner of the very building, the very firm, the very power they assumed I lacked. I walked through the office, carrying a cup of coffee, noting the oblivious chatter around me. People moved as if the world had not changed, but it had. My presence was no longer background, it was the axis around which decisions would now turn. Every glance, every whispered question, every hesitant request for guidance would come to me first. The irony was not lost on me. Those who had mocked my quiet demeanor would now answer to it, respect it, and ultimately depend on it. I paused outside the conference room, looking through the glass at the partners already assembling for their meeting. They had no idea. They believed in hierarchy, in visibility, in brash ambition. I believed in patience, discretion, and inevitability. And today, inevitability had my name on it. The morning light filtered through the tall office windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. I walked the corridors with a calm, deliberate pace, my heels clicking softly but assertively against the tile. Everyone around me was busy, typing, talking, strategizing, but I noticed the subtle shift in their energy. Something was in the air, though they hadn't realized what it was yet. It began with faint glances. A partner paused mid-conversation, hesitated, and looked in my direction. A junior analyst fumbled with papers, stealing nervous glances as if sensing a presence they hadn't anticipated. My presence alone was enough to start the ripple. I didn't need to announce my authority, it would manifest quietly, inevitably, and their own actions would reveal it. I stopped at the front desk, exchanged a polite nod with the receptionist, and checked the schedule for the day. Meetings, client calls, property documents, the usual flow, but the undercurrent of tension had shifted. My controlling shares meant nothing to them yet, but the announcement would bring the revelation. And by noon, their entire perception of me, of my role, of what it meant to be quiet Elise, would shatter. I remembered the whispered comments from years ago, how Marcy, a senior analyst, had joked about me being too soft, too quiet to matter, or how Jeremy, the partner, had referred to me as Invisible Elise. They had assumed that silence equaled passivity, that discretion equaled weakness. I had smiled, nodded, and worked in silence, cataloging their arrogance, storing every insult, every laugh, every small dismissal like currency for the day it would matter most. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the building's management assistant passed by and muttered something about an unusual email from the board. I kept my expression neutral but noted it quietly. Small signs, subtle tremors, hints of the earthquake to come. People were beginning to sense that something had shifted, even if they could not yet articulate it. By mid-morning, I observed small behavioral changes. Colleagues who had once brushed past me without acknowledgement now hesitated before entering my line of sight. Marcy lingered in her office doorway, tapping her pen nervously, while Jeremy adjusted his tie repeatedly, as though some invisible hand had shaken their confidence. They were unaware that the source of their unease was not intimidation, but inevitability, the slow, quiet assertion of authority that had been in motion for months. I returned to my office and reviewed the final draft of the leadership announcement again. My name was at the top, bold and authoritative, followed by the board members and partners who had assumed they were in control. I smiled faintly, the calm thrill of inevitability coursing through me. Elise, the one no one noticed, was about to become the axis around which the firm would now revolve. At 11:15, the first tremor of acknowledgement arrived. A junior associate peeked into my office, hesitant. Elise, the board, they sent something about the leadership announcement. I looked up slowly, expression composed. Yes, I said softly, it's in motion. Please continue with your tasks. The tremor of surprise in their eyes was subtle but unmistakable. Word would spread quickly, whispers would turn into understanding, and understanding into recognition. I walked to the conference room early, pretending to review the schedule for upcoming meetings. Inside, partners were assembling, chatting nervously, checking phones and emails. One by one, they received the official announcement, the controlling shares, the leadership designations, the transfer of authority, everything in writing, formally, and legally undeniable. Their reactions were immediate, though measured. Jeremy's jaw tightened. Marcy's fingers flexed anxiously on the edge of the table. Even senior partners who had long ignored me now exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The quiet one, the background noise, was no longer invisible. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. Patience had brought me to this point, and the beauty of inevitability was that it required no dramatics. I watched silently as the subtle panic began to unfold, the careful facade of control slipping from their faces. They had assumed hierarchy, visibility, and bravado were power. I had assumed patience, preparation and discretion, and the results were undeniable. By lunchtime, the entire office was abuzz with the news. Whispers, hushed conversations, nervous laughter, and tentative nods circulated. Colleagues sought me out for clarification, unsure how to proceed but knowing instinctively that the decision was final, the authority indisputable. I answered each query calmly, measuredly, allowing the recognition of power to sink in without forcing it. The very act of responding politely underscored the inevitability of my position. I remember the countless hours spent watching, learning, and planning, every overlooked detail, every ignored question, every dismissed contribution now crystallizing into tangible control. I had become something no one anticipated, the quiet authority, the legal owner of the firm's key shares, the arbiter of decisions. And it had happened without confrontation, without raising my voice, without spectacle, just patience, observation, and strategic action. By mid-afternoon, Jeremy approached my office, attempting to assert some semblance of authority. Elise, can we discuss the announcement? He asked, tone cautious, measured. I looked up from my papers slowly, expression calm. Of course, I said softly. Please have a seat. He hesitated, recognizing the subtle shift in dynamics. The quiet Elise was now the one they answered to, the one who dictated terms, the one who wielded power without theatrics. We spoke briefly professionally, about the implications of the announcement and the operational adjustments required. He was polite, cautious, and entirely aware that he was no longer the sole decision-maker. Every subtle nuance of his behavior, every careful choice of words, reflected the acknowledgement of authority that I had quietly cultivated for years. By the end of the day, the firm had adjusted to the new reality. Emails had been sent, meetings rescheduled, decisions documented. And all the while, I maintained the calm, deliberate composure that had become my trademark. Elise, the quiet, overlooked, underestimated one, had claimed her authority without spectacle, confrontation, or drama. As I left the office that evening, the city lights reflected on the glass facades of the buildings around me. I paused outside, inhaling the cool night air, and let the reality settle fully. The power balance had shifted. The colleagues who had dismissed me, mocked me, and overlooked me were now operating under my authority. I had played the long game, and the victory was undeniable, quiet, and complete. And in that moment, I realized the most satisfying triumph comes not from revenge, but from inevitability. The quiet one had become the undeniable force, the overlooked one had become the authority, and the underestimated one had claimed her place at the top, all without shouting, arguing, or seeking validation. Elise had won by being patient, strategic, and unshakably calm. The next morning, the office felt different, almost electric, though nothing had physically changed. The hum of printers, the tapping of keyboards, the chatter of colleagues, all were the same, yet the energy in the room had shifted. I walked through the corridors, each step deliberate, noticing subtle changes in posture, expressions, and conversation. Even before they realized, my presence was no longer background noise, it carried weight, authority, and inevitability. Marcy lingered in the corner near the copier, her hands hovering nervously over the buttons, as if expecting some unseen signal from me. Jeremy straightened his tie repeatedly, glancing toward my office door, hesitant to enter yet unable to ignore me. Partners who had previously ignored my input now stole glances, careful, assessing, aware that the quiet one, the supposedly invisible assistant, was now legally, undeniably, at the top. I passed by the main conference room, where a meeting had been scheduled to discuss the firm's ongoing projects. Their voices were louder than necessary, overly precise, slightly strained, the tension coating every word. They hadn't said it yet, but I could see it, they were recalibrating their perception of me. Where once there had been dismissal, there was now caution. Where once there had been mockery, there was now uncertainty. I smiled faintly, savoring the subtle satisfaction of inevitability. A young associate approached me at my desk, whispering hesitantly, Elise, the announcement, people are talking, they are confused. I nodded, calm and unflustered. Yes. It's as intended. Let them adjust. My tone was soft but carried authority, and in that small exchange, the ripple of recognition began to spread. The firm was slowly bending around me, not with confrontation, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the person they had dismissed now controlled the rules of engagement. By mid-morning, the subtle panic became harder to ignore. Emails from colleagues were cautious, carefully worded, asking for guidance that previously they would have ignored. A senior partner sent a message requesting clarification on operational procedures, copying me first instead of the outgoing leadership. A tremor of shock and hesitation ran through the office, unspoken yet palpable. The dynamics had shifted. The quiet one was now the center, the hub, the authority. I paused at the window, looking out across the city skyline, reflecting on the irony. Years of being underestimated, ignored, and dismissed had prepared me for this exact moment. Every whispered insult, every casual slight, every mocking glance had been recorded, not as a grievance, but as strategy, as fuel for the long game. They had assumed visibility equaled power. I had learned that patience, observation, and strategic timing created a far more unassailable authority. Then, just after noon, the first face-to-face recognition of my authority occurred. Jeremy approached my office, carefully, as if treading on fragile ground. Elise, may we discuss the upcoming client meeting schedule? He asked, voice polite, but tentative, almost submissive. I looked up from my papers, expression calm and controlled. Of course, Jeremy. Let's go over it together, I said. And just like that, the dynamic flipped. The The person who had dismissed me for years was now asking my permission, seeking my guidance, acknowledging my role. Over the next hour, subtle but powerful changes unfolded across the office. Colleagues who had once monopolized meetings now deferred to me, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with curiosity. Staff members whispered nervously, aware that decisions would now be filtered through my authority. Every interaction, every request, every question was a small acknowledgement of the inevitability I had quietly established. I walked through the office methodically, pausing at each desk, observing, noting reactions. Marcy's hands trembled slightly as she typed a message, eyes flicking up at me with a mixture of disbelief and begrudging acknowledgement. Elena, another colleague who had once dismissed me, adjusted her posture mid-conversation, aware that her words and actions would now be weighed against my authority. I said nothing, smiled faintly, and continued my rounds. My presence alone communicated what no announcement could fully convey: I was in control. By late afternoon, the ripple effect was unmistakable. Decisions that had once been debated endlessly now came to me first. Questions that had previously been ignored were now directed toward me, carefully phrased, respectful, tentative. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but unmistakable to anyone who had known the office dynamics before today. Elise, the quiet, overlooked, underestimated assistant, was now the axis upon which the firm's operations turned. I remembered the long nights at my desk, studying property documents, reviewing shares, preparing for the moment when the opportunity would present itself. The patience it had required, the careful silence I maintained while others laughed at my quiet nature, it all converged here, now, in the subtle, undeniable acknowledgement of power. They had assumed invisibility was weakness. They were discovering slowly that invisibility could conceal the most formidable force of all. As evening approached, I returned to my office, the hum of the city outside blending with the fading chatter inside. I paused, reflecting on the delicate dance I had orchestrated. Power was not about spectacle or dominance, it was about inevitability, patience, and the quiet precision of action. I had become what they had never imagined, the one who moved silently but with unstoppable force, the one who turned dismissal into strategy, the overlooked into authority. I looked out the window, the city lights reflecting off glass towers, and allowed myself a private smile. Elise had won not through confrontation or rage, but through careful observation, unshakable calm, and the inevitability of the moment she had prepared for years. The quiet authority she had cultivated now radiated through the firm, reshaping the dynamics, challenging assumptions, and demanding acknowledgement. That night, I left the office last, walking past the desks now quiet, employees leaving with subtle glances of respect and caution. I paused outside, inhaling the cool night air, savoring the sense of inevitability settling over the firm. My journey from unnoticed assistant to controlling shareholder was complete in its initial phase, but the ripples had only just begun. The ex-colleagues who had mocked, ignored, and underestimated me would now operate within the structure I controlled, their confidence tempered, their assumptions challenged, their perception of Elise forever altered. And as I walked down the quiet streets, the distant hum of the city echoing softly, I whispered to myself, they never saw it coming. The quiet one always wins in the end. The next morning, the office felt charged, almost electric, as if every desk, chair, and computer had absorbed the subtle tremor of the previous day. I walked through the corridors with the quiet confidence I had honed over years, heels clicking softly, clipboard in hand, every step deliberate. The subtle shift in energy was palpable. Colleagues who had once ignored me, dismissed me, and mocked my quiet demeanor now moved with hesitation, awareness, even a hint of reverence. The air itself seemed to recognize the change. I paused outside the main conference room, watching the staff assemble for the morning briefing. Marcy lingered near the doorway, hands clasped tightly, her posture betraying tension and disbelief. Jeremy adjusted his tie repeatedly, eyes flicking toward me nervously. Partners who had once monopolized attention now exchanged tentative glances, uncertain how to navigate this new hierarchy. The quiet Elise, the invisible assistant, was no longer just part of the background, she was the axis around which the firm's operations now turned. By mid-morning, subtle changes had begun to cascade. Emails that previously bypassed me were now copied to my inbox. Decisions that had once been made in hushed meetings without my input now required my acknowledgement, my confirmation, or my signature. Even small procedural questions, once trivial and overlooked, were directed to me first. Every interaction, every email, every request quietly reinforced the shift I had orchestrated. The ripple effect was unstoppable, silent, and precise. Elise had always been an observer. I had catalogued every arrogance, every careless remark, every dismissive glance. And now all those small pieces of memory were transforming into leverage, into control, into subtle authority. When a junior associate hesitated before asking a question, I recognized the unspoken fear. The ones who once mocked me were beginning to understand that the quietest voice could carry the greatest power. The first overt confrontation came from Jeremy, carefully, almost reluctantly, in the conference room after the morning briefing. "Elise, can we review the client strategy together?" His tone was measured, polite, but tense. I looked up slowly, expression serene, and nodded. "Of course," I said, gesturing to a seat beside me. The dynamic had flipped seamlessly. He who had once dismissed me was now seeking guidance, validation, and direction. And in that moment I realized how fully the tide had turned. Authority does not always announce itself with shouting, it whispers in the recalibration of those around you. The subtle panic of my ex-colleagues became harder to ignore as the day progressed. Marcy approached my office door, hands slightly trembling, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Elise, I think we need to discuss the operational changes for next quarter," she said, voice tight with apprehension. I smiled faintly, gesturing to a chair. "Of course, Marcy. Let's go through it together." Every word, every gesture, every calm movement reinforced the quiet dominance I had cultivated. The ones who had once laughed now deferred, nervously navigating the authority they had never anticipated. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effect had spread to clients, suppliers, and administrative staff. Questions and clarifications were routed to me first. Decisions were weighed against my acknowledgement. Subtle shifts in posture, tone, and eye contact signaled the slow but undeniable recognition of my authority. The invisible assistant had become the one everyone observed, measured, and respected, not through confrontation, but through deliberate inevitability. I remembered the long nights of preparation, the careful study of property shares, the legal documents, the meticulous planning. I remembered the years of mockery, of laughter behind my back, of being dismissed as too quiet to matter. Each insult, each slight, had been absorbed and transformed into a strategy, quietly accumulating power until the moment it would matter most. And now, as I watched the ripple of realization spreading through the office, I felt the calm, deliberate satisfaction of inevitability. By evening, the office had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tasks were completed, questions were asked, and decisions were documented, but the subtle hierarchy had shifted. Colleagues who had once commanded attention now deferred to me, their arrogance tempered by the recognition of authority. The quiet Elise was no longer overlooked, ignored, or underestimated. I had become the force they had never anticipated, the authority they could not sidestep, the arbiter of decisions they had once assumed belonged elsewhere. Walking to my office at the end of the day, I paused outside the glass walls of the conference room, observing the subtle adjustments in posture and tone. They were learning, slowly but inevitably, that the quiet one carries power not through spectacle, but through precision, patience, and calm inevitability. Every glance, every whisper, every hesitant request reinforced the authority I had quietly claimed. Later, I reflected in my office, watching the city lights shimmer against the building's reflective glass. The firm had changed in subtle, unstoppable ways. The colleagues who had dismissed me, mocked me, and ignored me were now navigating a world where my decisions mattered, my guidance was sought, and my authority was acknowledged. I had won not through confrontation or anger, but through quiet strategy, meticulous planning, and unshakable patience. And as I packed my bag and prepared to leave for the night, I whispered to myself, a private acknowledgement of the inevitable. They laughed, they dismissed, they assumed I was invisible. And now, everything bends around the quiet one. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting sharp lines across my office floor. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the city awaken, the office building buzzing with quiet tension. Something had changed irreversibly overnight. The subtle recalibration that began days ago had now become palpable. Colleagues moved with caution, whispered strategically, and cast nervous glances my way. Every movement, every pause, every hesitant glance told me what I already knew. The quiet Elise was no longer invisible. By mid-morning, the first waves of acknowledgement arrived. Emails that had once gone unanswered were now routed to me first. Staff members who had dismissed my opinions were now seeking guidance, consulting me, awaiting my sign-off. Jeremy approached cautiously, adjusting his tie, shifting from foot to foot, unsure how to navigate the invisible barrier that had silently been erected between his arrogance and my authority. "Elise, can we finalize the client strategy together?" he asked, voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and caution. I looked up calmly, meeting his eyes steadily. "Of course, Jeremy," I said softly, gesturing to the chair beside me. He sat, stiff, listening intently. Every word I spoke carried weight, every subtle movement reinforcing the authority that had been quietly established over years of preparation. Marcy, who had once mocked my quiet demeanor, lingered nervously by the conference room doorway. Her hands flexed, eyes darting, as if anticipating some dramatic confrontation. But there would be none. Authority does not need to yell, it manifests in inevitability, precision, and calm dominance. I smiled faintly, acknowledging her presence without needing to speak. She knew, finally, that her assumptions about me had been wrong. The ripple of recognition spread through the office like an electric current. Junior associates whispered to each other, hesitant but aware. Partners who had once monopolized meetings now deferred to me, adjusting their strategies to align with my guidance. The subtle panic of understanding began to take hold. The quiet assistant had become the power behind the decisions, the arbiter of operations, the one whose name was now first on the leadership announcement. I paused outside the main office floor, watching from a distance as the staff moved with measured caution. Elena, another colleague who had ignored my contributions, was now consulting a manual I had prepared for operational procedures, her posture tense, her face pale. Jeremy held a small stack of documents, hesitating before entering my office. Even the building itself seemed different, charged with the silent acknowledgement of authority. By early afternoon, I began to exercise the tangible consequences of my control. Decisions that had once been made without my input now required my review. Changes in staffing, project priorities, and client communications all flowed through me. The subtle shift I had orchestrated became visible, undeniable. Colleagues who had once assumed dominance were now navigating a hierarchy they could not alter, responding to the quiet authority they had long underestimated. I reflected on the years of preparation, the long nights of observation, the careful cataloging of arrogance, the patient waiting while others assumed I was inconsequential. Each slight, each dismissive remark, each laugh at my quiet nature had been recorded, transformed into a strategy, a subtle leverage that would manifest now in full force. The elegance of patience, the precision of inevitability, and the power of quiet authority had all converged in this moment. Late in the afternoon, Jeremy approached again, more hesitant this time, seeking direction on a client matter that had previously been entirely under his control. "Elise, should we proceed with the merger proposal as drafted?" he asked, voice careful, restrained. I looked at the documents, considered the variables, then responded succinctly, calmly, authoritatively. "No. Adjust the projections, revise the approach, and include my notes. Then proceed." His eyes widened slightly, absorbing not only the decision but the quiet assertion of power behind it. Across the office, Marcy's expression reflected dawning realization. Her mockery, her arrogance, her dismissal, all now irrelevant. She had underestimated the quiet one, and the consequences were inescapable. She approached later, asking questions I had anticipated, deferring to my judgment, navigating a structure she once assumed she controlled. The elegance of inevitability was now fully apparent. No confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic spectacle, just authority silently, irrevocably exercised. By evening, the office was quiet, subdued, but the energy had shifted permanently. Staff, associates, and partners alike moved with careful respect, aware that Elise, the once overlooked assistant, was now the power behind the firm. Emails were routed through me, decisions were reviewed with my approval, and even the smallest procedural adjustments required my acknowledgement. The subtle panic of recognition had matured into full understanding. The quiet one could not be ignored. I returned to my office, looking out over the city as the sun dipped behind the skyline. The triumph was not in confrontation, but in precision, patience, and strategic inevitability. The ex-colleagues who had dismissed, ignored, and mocked me were now operating entirely within the framework I controlled. Authority, I realized, was most powerful when exercised without anger, without spectacle, without a single raised voice. It existed in inevitability, in calculated precision, and in the recognition that dismissal has consequences. Later, alone, I allowed myself a private smile. The journey from invisible assistant to controlling authority had been long, quiet, and deliberate. The subtle, undeniable shift in the firm's dynamics was proof that patience and strategy outweigh arrogance and loud ambition. The quiet Elise had become unstoppable, not by shouting, not by confrontation, but by inevitable, deliberate action. As night fell, the building hummed with a new rhythm. Colleagues departed, staff closed their laptops, and the city lights reflected off the office windows. I stepped outside, inhaling the cool night air, and whispered to myself, a private acknowledgement of triumph. They mocked, they ignored, they assumed I was invisible. And now, everything bends around the quiet one. The morning sun spilled through the office windows, painting the desks in golden light. It was calm, deceptively ordinary, but I knew the undercurrent beneath the familiar hum of keyboards and quiet conversations. Everything had changed, irreversibly. I walked through the corridors with deliberate grace, observing reactions with the same patience and attention I had honed over years. Where once my presence had been ignored, now it carried weight, authority, and inevitability. Every glance, every hesitation, every whispered question was a silent acknowledgement of my position. By mid-morning, the firm had settled into its new rhythm, one I had carefully orchestrated. Emails were routed through me, minor and major decisions alike required my review, and staff who had once dismissed my input now deferred politely, seeking guidance and confirmation. Jeremy, who had once sneered at my quiet demeanor, approached me with documents in hand, eyes tentative but respectful. "Elise, your input is needed on the next client proposal," he said softly. I looked at the stack, then at him, and nodded with calm authority. "Thank you, Jeremy. Let's review it together." His posture shifted subtly, a quiet surrender to the inevitability of my role. The quiet satisfaction of watching the subtle panic and recalibration in my colleagues was a profound reward. Marcy, Elena, and the rest of the team were learning to navigate this new hierarchy with caution, the arrogance of the past replaced with tentative respect. I moved through my office like a conductor, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. The invisible Elise was now undeniable, an authority that did not need to shout, to assert, or to demand. It existed in the certainty of inevitability. I paused by the window and reflected on the years that had brought me here. The countless late nights balancing spreadsheets, reviewing legal documents, and quietly observing every slight and whisper had all led to this. Every mocking comment, every dismissive glance, every assumption about my supposed quiet incompetence had been recorded, stored, and transformed into strategy. Today, that strategy had fully manifested. Elise was no longer a background character, she was the pivot, the authority, the quiet storm no one had anticipated. By afternoon, the firm had fully adjusted to the shift. Decisions moved efficiently through my oversight, projects realigned with my guidance, and even the most arrogant partners now consulted me before taking action. I watched the ripple effect quietly, noting subtle behavioral changes, hesitation, measured speech, cautious gestures. They were learning, slowly but surely, that quiet patience had the power to shape entire structures, entire organizations, entire dynamics. Later, as I sat in my office with the sun dipping below the horizon, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The triumph was not dramatic, not public, not fueled by confrontation. It was silent, precise, and complete. Authority, I realized, is strongest when it arrives as an inevitability, when the underdog patiently orchestrates the conditions for irreversible success. Elise, the one they had overlooked, underestimated, and mocked, had quietly claimed what was rightfully hers. The ex-colleagues who had ridiculed me were now living under a structure I controlled, navigating decisions that flowed through my oversight, adjusting to the reality they had long refused to see. Their disbelief, their hesitation, their subtle panic had transformed into acknowledgement, respect, and cautious cooperation. I had not sought revenge in anger, I had achieved it in inevitability. The quiet one had won. As night fell and the office emptied, I lingered by the window, gazing out at the city lights reflecting off the buildings. The calm triumph of patience, precision, and quiet authority settled around me like a warm, invisible cloak. Elise had proven that power is not always loud, that visibility does not guarantee influence, and that the underestimated can become unstoppable when strategy, observation, and patience converge. I whispered softly to myself, a quiet affirmation that had been years in the making. They laughed, they ignored, they assumed I was invisible. And now, Everything bends around the quiet one. The city hummed below, unaware of the quiet victory achieved within these walls, unaware that the invisible had become the undeniable.